The suit cost $50 from a church thrift shop. Silas Mercer pressed it with steam from a dented kettle, while his 6-year-old daughter fed cereal to a stuffed fox named Thimble and asked whether the jacket was itching because it was fancy or because it was lying. He had $86 left after rent. He had 31 pages of supply chain data he had built over 2 months of late evenings. And he had a meeting that morning at a company whose new CEO would take one look at his lapels, decide he was a liability, and fire him 4 minutes before the most important negotiation of her career, the one only he could save. The kettle had a dent on its left side from the time Tamsin knocked it off the counter reaching for the cereal box, and the steam that came from its spout was uneven because of it, thicker on one side, thinner on the other, like breath through a cracked window. Silas held the $50 suit jacket at arm's length and let the steam work into the wool. The jacket was charcoal, a shade too dark for spring, and one of the cuff buttons was a slightly different gray, because he had replaced it from an old winter coat when the original popped off in the thrift shop dressing room. $6 for the dry cleaning, $50 for the suit, $86 left in the account after rent, after the electric bill, after Tamsin's school lunch money, after the brake repair he had been putting off for 3 weeks because the estimate from Klein's garage said $420, and the dashboard amber light glowed every time he started the engine. Tamsin sat on the kitchen counter in pajamas with small foxes printed on them. Thimble, a stuffed fox with one ear stitched back on in thread that did not match, was propped against the toaster. She fed it a single Cheerio, waited, then fed it another with the seriousness of a person responsible for a dependent. Does the suit itch because it's fancy or because it's lying? Silas looked at her. She was studying the jacket the way she studied everything, head tilted, eyes slightly narrowed, as though objects owed her an explanation. It just needs to get me through the day. Through the day like school, or through the day like the dentist? Somewhere in between. She accepted this. She wiped crumbs off the counter with the flat of her hand and repositioned Thimble so the fox could see the jacket better. In the bedroom mirror 10 minutes later, Silas looked like a man trying. The pants broke slightly too high at the ankle. The lapels sat a 1/4 inch wider than anything made in the last 5 years, but the fabric held its press. The dry cleaning tag was pulled, and if nobody looked too closely at the cuff button, or the way the collar did not quite lie flat against the shirt, he could pass for someone who belonged in a merger room. The dry cleaning receipt was still on the kitchen table. Next to it, a permission slip for Tamsin's field trip he had signed at midnight. Next to that, the brake estimate, circled twice in red. Tamsin appeared in the doorway, holding Thimble by one leg. You bought the nice suit so they would listen. Did they listen wrong? He was not wearing the suit yet. She was talking about the future as though it had already happened. 6-year-olds did that sometimes, spoke in tenses that had not arrived, as if the shape of a thing was already visible to them. They haven't listened yet, Silas said. That's today. Okay. She smoothed a wrinkle from Thimble's ear. Don't let them listen wrong. Halcyon Motion Systems occupied a 4-story glass building on the east side of Columbus, with a lobby that smelled like new carpet and conditioned air. Silas arrived 40 minutes early. His meeting binder, 31 pages of supplier transition data and return rate tables he had built over 2 months of evenings after Tamsin went to sleep, was aligned square on his lap. Rosalind Quill, Vivian Rusk's chief of staff, was blotting a coffee ring from the printed agenda with her sleeve when she noticed him sitting in reception. She nodded the way people nod to someone they have seen in the building but cannot place. Hollis Vane arrived 9 minutes later. He wore a suit that cost more than Silas's monthly rent and moved through the hallway the way men with signing authority move. Center line, no pause. He glanced at Silas and stopped for 2 seconds. That was all. But Silas saw the assessment. The lapels, the trouser break, the cuff button. Hollis leaned into the conference room where Vivian was reviewing name placards for the Hoshin delegation. We are hosting people who notice everything. His voice was low, conversational, the particular kind of quiet that carries further than volume. The delegation flew 12 hours to evaluate integration leadership. If we put that level of presentation in the room, we are telling them we did not prepare. Vivian looked through the glass partition at Silas. She had been CEO for 11 weeks. The board wanted the $10 million integration deal closed before the quarter ended. She was under the kind of pressure that makes intelligent people move too fast. Pull him. It took less than 4 minutes. Rosalind delivered the message in the corridor with a voice that was steady, professional, and clearly not her idea. Presentation standards. Executive protocol. Effective immediately. Badge deactivated by noon. Silas stood. He squared his meeting binder against his hip, once to align the pages, once to check the order. The habit was so deep it survived the moment that should have killed it. Then notice this. I was on time. He walked out through the lobby with his binder under his arm and his visitor badge still clipped to the jacket pocket of the suit that had cost $50.06 for the cleaning. He was not supposed to pick Tamsin up until 4:30, but the after-school program cost money he no longer had a reason to spend, so he was in the pickup lane at 3:15, engine idling, the dashboard brake light glowing its patient amber. Tamsin climbed into the back seat, buckled herself in, positioned Thimble on her knee facing forward, and studied her father's face in the rearview mirror with the focus of someone checking whether a picture had been hung straight. You still have your badge on. Silas looked down. The visitor badge was clipped to his jacket pocket. He pulled it off and dropped it into the console. And your papers are too small. She meant his meeting binder. He had folded it in half to fit it into the door pocket, which he never did. He always kept it flat. She noticed imbalance instantly. Crooked frames, lopsided stacks, adults whose words and faces did not match. Did they listen wrong? Silas pulled out of the lane. His hands were at 10 and 2, and his jaw had a line of tension in it that had not been there that morning. They listened to the wrong thing. Tamsin did not ask what the wrong thing was. She hooked 2 fingers through the side seam of his jacket, not his hand, the jacket, and held on for 3 blocks without speaking. Darnell Pike's text arrived at 4:47, while Silas was heating canned soup and Tamsin was drawing trucks on the back of the field trip permission slip. The first photo showed a cracked pallet wrap on a return cage in the Dayton distribution center. The second showed relabeled seals with moisture damage at the adhesive line, buckled paper, ink slightly run, meaning humidity had been sitting against the product for 72 hours minimum. Darnell had supervised the Halcyon dock for 9 years. A third message. If that deck says 2-day recovery on returns, it's lying. I'm looking at 14 days of backlog in this cage alone. Silas set the soup spoon down. The merger deck assumed a 48-hour return recovery window across all regional points. If Dayton alone was running 14 days, the margin forecast Hollis was presenting was built on a number that did not exist. Dad? Tamsin was watching him from the table with a crayon in one hand, and Thimble wedged between her elbow and the chair arm. I have to go back to the building. The building where they listened wrong? Yes. Can I come? He did not have anyone to leave her with. The neighbor who sometimes watched her was working nights. His mother was in Zanesville, an hour and a half east. You can come, but you have to be very quiet in the hallways. I'm always quiet in hallways. Hallways are for walking, not talking, Ms. Pena says. Ms. Pena is right. They drove back to Halcyon with the windows cracked and Thimble riding in the cup holder, one ear flopped over the edge. Darnell met them at the loading dock. He was still in his high-vis vest, one glove smeared with grease from a jammed conveyor roller, and he looked at Tamsin, then the suit, then Silas's face. You brought your kid to a service entrance. I'm not here for my job now. Darnell understood. He led them through the freight elevator, which smelled like packing tape and floor cleaner and vibrated hard enough that Tamsin held Thimble against her chest with both hands. Rosalind found them outside the second-floor break room. She had been trying to reach someone who understood the logistics numbers for 20 minutes because the meeting was going wrong, and nobody at the table could explain why. In the main conference room, Vivian was presenting the integration timeline on a projection screen. Hollis sat beside her, pressing for initialed intent before the full diligence package had been reviewed. The Hoshin delegation occupied the far side of the table in precise rank order. Takumi Endo, the senior operations executive, had inspected the business card tray and verified the name placards before he sat. Mina Sato, the bilingual integration consultant, had arranged tea and bilingual folders so the seating matched hierarchy. Takumi asked one question. It was delivered with the patience of a man who had flown 12 hours and would not be managed. "You are describing a timeline. I asked about accountability. If your Dayton facility cannot isolate defective returns within the transition window, who owns the exposure?" The room went still. Hollis smiled, a particular kind of smile that functioned as a pause, while he calculated which version of the truth to deploy. Silas was standing at the edge of the room. Rosalind had let him in through the side door. Tamsin was in the anteroom with a coloring book, and Thimble positioned on the chair beside her like a second attendee. "The answer is Dayton, not Yokohama." Silas's voice was level. "No performance, no apology." That's where the break starts. Lane 412, inbound from the Cincinnati hub. The isolation protocol was revised in October, but the dock crew never received updated handling specs because the revision was filed as a sales addendum, not an operations bulletin. "Returns are being relabeled without reseal inspection. Your 48-hour window is a projection, not a measurement." Takumi looked at Silas for 4 seconds. He looked at the suit, at the binder under his arm, at the absence of a badge. Then he turned to Vivian and waited for her to explain why the only person who had answered his question was standing at the edge of the room instead of sitting at the table. In the anteroom, Mina Sato brought tea in 2 cups, one for Silas, one smaller one she set in front of Tamsin with a napkin folded underneath. Tamsin was drawing trucks in a line across the back of a printed agenda she had found on a chair. Thimble sat at the head of the truck line, supervising. Silas answered Mina's questions about the returns loop without defending himself, without explaining the firing, without performance of any kind. He walked through container dwell times at the Cincinnati spoke, defect return sequences, the 40-day rolling average on lane 412 that showed the recovery window had never been under 11 days in the past quarter, and the 3 points where Hollis's revised deck diverged from the plant floor data Silas had originally compiled. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has carried the numbers in his head for 2 months and is simply setting them down where someone can finally use them. "He talks like the boxes have names," Tamsin said without looking up. "They do when they come back opened," Silas said. Vivian appeared in the anteroom doorway. She had come to retrieve Mina, but she stopped. She stood there for 6 seconds watching a man in a $50 suit explain vendor lead time slippage to a bilingual consultant, while his daughter drew trucks with a crayon and a stuffed fox sat on a stack of folders. Something in the geometry of it, the quiet, the competence, the child, held her in the doorway longer than she intended. The breakout happened in an overflow room with a movable whiteboard and overhead lights that buzzed faintly. Mina arranged it without an announcement and without Hollis's permission. The Japanese delegation wanted operational clarity, and Silas was the only person in the building who had it. He started with the suppliers, mapping them by humidity exposure zone. The Dayton cage sat in a facility with no climate partition between the dock bay and the return staging area, which meant every pallet that came through the bay door between April and October absorbed ambient moisture for the full duration of its dwell time. He drew dock turnaround windows by regional spoke, Cincinnati averaging 9.4 hours, Louisville at 11, Indianapolis running at 14 since they lost a second shift dock lead in August. Then he showed where the current promise structure reversed, cause and effect. Halcyon was committing to recovery timelines driven by quarterly sales targets, not actual throughput capacity. The 48-hour window in the merger deck had been copied from a goal-setting slide and pasted into a binding operational commitment. Nobody had checked whether the docks could do it. He marked the 3 lanes where palletization error exceeded 2% and walked through the cascade. A relabeled return without reseal inspection ships to a secondary buyer, arrives with moisture damage, triggers a quality claim that pulls 2 people off the line for a week. Multiply that across 3 lanes, over 6 months of integration. Takumi asked about vendor lead time slippage on the secondary supply chain. Silas drew it from memory. 38 days average, 51 at peak during the Q3 surge, with a 3-week visibility gap between the purchase order and the dock receipt, because Halcyon's tracking system did not differentiate between confirmed and estimated delivery windows. He had flagged this in the original deck. The flag had been removed in Hollis's revision. "Do not agree because I am certain," Silas said. "Agree when the chain makes sense." Yui Sakakibara made a note in the margin of her folder. Rosalind stood near the door and watched a man who had been fired 6 hours earlier rebuild the technical foundation of a $10 million deal on a whiteboard with a marker that was running out of ink. On the side table next to a water carafe, Tamsin's drawing sat where she had left it. One of the trucks had a frowning face on the cab. Another had what appeared to be a fox riding on the roof. When the group returned to the main conference room, Takumi placed both hands flat on the table and looked at Vivian. "We will not sign expertise out of the room." Hollis leaned forward. "Mr. Endo, the individual you've been speaking with was separated from the company this morning for cause. His access has been—" "His materials were correct," Takumi said. "Yours were not. That is the relevant distinction." Rosalind opened a manila folder she had been holding since the anteroom. "His personnel file lists junior sales staff. It omits 6 years of warehouse coordination, dock operations, and plant-level systems work. The file was updated 4 months ago." She paused. "By Mr. Vane's office." Vivian's hands, which had been resting on the table with fingers spread, pulled together until the knuckles touched. She looked at Hollis. She looked at the personnel file. She looked through the glass partition at the anteroom where Tamsin sat cross-legged on a leather chair with Thimble in her lap, waiting the way children wait when they do not know what the adults are deciding, but understand that it matters. Mr. Mercer stays, in the room, at the table. The break was called 10 minutes later. The Japanese delegation stepped into the anteroom for tea. Mina refilled the water carafe. Rosalind printed backup copies of the corrected whiteboard data. The building hummed the way corporate buildings hum during pauses that are not pauses. Everyone recalculating. Everyone adjusting what they had assumed was going to happen. Hollis found Silas in the hallway near the freight elevator during the break. The overhead light was fluorescent and unflattering, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look temporary. Tamsin sat against the wall 15 feet away, drawing on her own knee with a green crayon. "Silas." The voice was warm. Hollis delivered threats the way expensive restaurants deliver bad news, folded inside something pleasant. "There is a severance package. 60 days full pay. I can add a signing incentive. 20,000. Call it a consulting fee. You walk out clean. I smooth things with Vivian. And in 6 months you return to a better title. Everyone wins." Silas watched Tamsin draw. "Take the money. Let grown people finish the room." "My daughter is the reason I don't." Hollis's smile held. It held the way a cable holds before it snaps. Everything in place, nothing underneath. "You're making a mistake, Silas." "No. I made a suit work on $86. I don't make mistakes with numbers." Back in the conference room, Silas called Darnell on the speakerphone. The line opened to the sound of a reversing alarm and a forklift cage rattling against concrete. Someone in the background was shouting lane numbers. Darnell held his phone camera up to the returns cage in Dayton, and the room saw what Silas had been describing all afternoon. Cracked pallet wrap stacked 4 layers deep, the plastic sheeting torn along the corner seams where it had been reused instead of replaced. Relabeled seals with moisture damage visible at the adhesive line. The paper was buckled and the ink had run slightly, which meant the humidity had been sitting there long enough to penetrate the label stock. 14 days of unprocessed returns in a cage that was supposed to turn over in 2. Behind the cage, 3 more pallets were staged against the wall with yellow damage tags hanging from their shrink wrap. "You can hide a slide," Darnell said over the alarm. "You can't hide a cage full of returns." Tamsin had migrated under the conference table during the call. She sat cross-legged with Thimble in her lap, watching the screen from below the table's edge with the seriousness of someone reviewing evidence. She whispered, "That one's the sad one," and pointed at a box with a torn label hanging from its corner. Darnell heard her through the speaker. He laughed, a real, startled full sound that cut through the reversing alarm. "Kid's right. That one came back twice." Hollis moved fast after that. He stepped into the corridor and returned with 2 building security officers in blue blazers with radio earpieces, and the careful posture of men who had been told to be visible. The smile was gone from Hollis's face. In its place was something flat and procedural, the expression of a man switching from persuasion to authority, because persuasion had failed. Mr. Mercer's access was terminated this morning. He is an unauthorized individual on the executive floor with proprietary integration materials. I need him escorted out. Now." The officers stepped forward. Tamsin was standing beside Silas. She was not crying. Her face was still and composed in the particular way of a child who has learned to hold very quiet when things around her go wrong. She hooked 2 fingers through the side seam of his jacket and held on. "Do not touch him in front of my child." 1 sentence. No volume. The corridor heard it the way corridors hear things that matter, through stillness, through the absence of anything else. Vivian was 3 steps behind Hollis. Rosalind was beside her, holding a printed email chain and a folder of time-stamped doc logs. "The risk memo Mr. Mercer submitted before this morning's meeting," Rosalind said, opening the folder so Vivian could see the headers. "Sent to Mr. Vane's inbox at 6:14 a.m., not forwarded to the integration team, not included in the diligence package, not referenced in any material presented today." She turned to the second page. "The Hoshin delegation requested exactly this level of operational detail yesterday afternoon. The request was logged by Ms. Sato and routed to Mr. Vane's office. No response was sent." Mina stepped forward from the conference room threshold. "Mr. Vane did not remove a liability. He removed the answer." Vivian looked at the email chain. She looked at the doc logs with their timestamps running from 6:14 a.m. through the morning meeting and into the afternoon, a paper trail that showed exactly who had known what and when, and who had made sure the room did not. She looked at Hollis standing between 2 security officers. He had called to remove a father whose 6-year-old daughter was gripping the seam of his jacket in a hallway that smelled like new carpet and tasted like a decision that could not be walked back. "Stand down," Vivian said to the officers. Then, to Hollis, "Sit down, Mr. Vane." They reset the table. Mina adjusted the placards. Rosalind brought fresh water. Hollis sat at the far end with his phone face down and his hands flat, the posture of a man who understood that the room no longer belonged to him. Silas did not give a speech. He did not perform gratitude or relief or vindication. He opened the whiteboard notes Mina had photographed, pulled up the corrected lane data on the projection screen, and walked through a restructured integration proposal that looked nothing like the one Hollis had tried to push through that morning. Phased rollout across 3 stages instead of a single commitment date. Stage 1 covering the Cincinnati and Louisville spokes only, with Dayton held out until reseal inspection protocols were verified on the ground. Joint review checkpoints at 60 and 120 days, staffed by operations leads from both companies, not sales executives. A shared risk register that both sides could audit independently, with defect return data feeding in from dock-level scanners rather than from quarterly summaries. Transparent recovery metrics built from actual throughput, the number of sealed units cleared per shift, rather than the sales projections Hollis had used to calculate a timeline that no dock in the Midwest could have met. Takumi asked 3 questions. Each one was specific, about reseal verification cadence, about the secondary supply chain's visibility gap, about what would happen if the 60-day checkpoint revealed that Dayton was still underperforming. Each one received a specific answer. Silas did not guess. When he did not know a number, he said so, and he said when he would have it. Takumi nodded at the honesty, the way a man nods at something he has been waiting to hear all day. He was not closing a deal. He was protecting both sides from the same lie. "I would rather delay your signature than sell you a lie," Silas said. Takumi looked at Yui. Yui closed her folder, a small gesture from a woman who had been taking notes all afternoon and had decided there was nothing left to add. "Then we can sign," Takumi said. The pen moved across the paper with the sound that pens make on good stock, a faint drag, a slight catch at the turn of a signature. Yui signed second, Vivian third. The amended terms were bilingual, printed on paper that Rosalind had run through the machine twice because the first copy had a toner streak, and she did not want anyone in the room to look at imperfection when the day had already carried enough of it. The room shifted, not with applause, not with handshakes, with the particular quiet that follows when something broken has been set right, and the people in the room are still absorbing the weight of the correction. Mina translated the final clauses. Silas sat at the table in his $50 suit with the mismatched cuff button and the lapels that were a quarter inch too wide, and he did not smooth them, and he did not explain them, and nobody in the room was looking at them. After the signatures, Vivian asked Silas to stay. Tamsin was in the anteroom teaching Thimble to balance upright on the arm of a leather chair. The fox kept falling over, and she kept setting it up again with the persistence of someone who believed that gravity was a problem of technique. "Lead project director," Vivian said. "Full reinstatement. Salary correction to match the scope. Formal authority over integration reporting. Direct line to my office. Benefits backdated. The termination will be expunged from your file." She said it without decoration, the way people speak when they know the facts are doing the work and anything added would cheapen them. Silas waited. He did not thank her yet. He touched the edge of his binder, squared it once, checked the order, and the habit that had survived the morning survived the evening too. "I am sorry," Vivian said. "Not for the protocol, for the speed. I made a decision in 4 minutes that should not have been made in 4 weeks. And I let someone else make it for me by standing in the right spot at the right time." She said it in front of Rosalind. She did not lower her voice or close the door. The apology cost her something visible. The steadiness she had been holding all day wavered for half a second in the line of her mouth, and she let it cost her without retreating into explanation. Tamsin appeared in the doorway holding Thimble by one arm. "Does this mean the suit worked?" Vivian looked at the girl, then at the suit, then at the man inside it, who had not changed his clothes, or his posture, or his voice since 6 o'clock that morning. "It worked when you wore it. They were late." The apartment was quiet when they got home. The soup from the afternoon was still on the stove, the spoon resting in the pot at the angle Silas had left it, when Darnell's text arrived, and the evening changed direction. He turned the burner on and stood at the counter while it heated, his tie pulled loose. The jacket hung on the back of the kitchen chair where the dry cleaning receipt and the break estimate still sat. The receipt he folded and placed in the drawer, with the field trip permission slips and the immunization records and the other pieces of paper that had done their job. The estimate he left on the table, because now he could pay it. $420 for the brake repair. The amber light on the dashboard would go dark by Friday. Tamsin sat across from him with Thimble in the sugar bowl, a position the fox had occupied during most homework sessions, and nearly every dinner they had eaten in this kitchen for 3 years, ever since Lena died and the apartment became a place that Silas held together through routine, repetition, and the particular discipline of a man who could not afford to fall apart because someone small was watching. She had pulled the sewing tin from the shelf, the same tin Silas had used to attach the replacement cuff button that morning, and she was stitching the loose button tighter, her tongue between her teeth, her stitches uneven but serious. "Keep the suit," she said. "Why?" "So it remembers." She tied the thread off with a knot that was too large and bit it clean. Thimble watched from the sugar bowl with his mismatched ear. The kettle with the dent sat on the back burner, and the steam, when it came, was still uneven, thicker on one side, thinner on the other, but the suit was pressed and the button held, and the father and the girl sat in a kitchen where the breathing room was new and the warmth was not. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so the next one finds you too.